Well, thank you, Dr. York, for saving the day and coming to the rescue. Um, Getting ready for a program in like 15 minutes, so I mean, I've been prepping for this one. Hopefully there's no interruptions. But to, I guess, to delve into your multifaceted sets of questions, after reviewing some of the readings and looking back into myself, our student development theory, I think the first question that I'd like to tackle is looking at a theory and talk about its biases, as well as looking into how it can be used for all types of students. Um, Ironically enough, I did my project on Fowler's faith-based development and found it to be interestingly multicultural, but in the framework of a Christian mindset. I think the bias that we see in that identity or that development theory is that it's based on Christian males, but the language in the book at least suggests that it's not, or suggests that it's more based on just faith and a personal development of faith. But some of the things it talks about is how we develop through faith, that primal faith where we just sort of believe what we're told, or we believe what um, our parents believe or what our churches believe or whatever. And using even the term church would assume that church is something that all religions go to and all religions do. And in this situation, that is not the case. So I think when you're trying to use that theory, especially in like a public institution, it's best to look at it from the term faith rather than any sort of religious connotation. So faith is the idea of believing in something greater, or believing in something that you may not necessarily have proof in. So in some situations, that is faith in God, or faith in a God of a sort, or the devil, or whatever. And sometimes that means yourself, or something, humanity. And I think in that context, this particular theory also can be utilized for those that may not fit into the way that the identity was structured, or the theory was structured. So to say that even though there is a bias, there is also a non-biased interpretation of the same theory. Interestingly enough, Buddhism would call stage 3, which is synthetic conventional thinking, sort of the way you view religion in a Buddhist sense. The idea that you constantly critique what's going on, and you're looking at self-spiritual development, and you're always looking inward to improve outward, in some sections of Buddhism. And so I think it's interesting to see that theory can both fall into the stereotypical Christian male society that it was framed on, but also can be utilized even for non-faith based students. So if we know someone has a faith in science, or a faith in themselves, or a faith in something, in the government, I don't know, anything, we can framework that idea and that development theory to help students progress. And I think even with that, we can use it to break down some of the barriers for students that are faith-based, in looking at what faith actually means. I guess in a critical world, or in a world that is not always about one particular faith. So kind of looking at that question, I feel like that's sort of where I was going with that. I think the second part is a little bit easier to talk about, in the sense that it's a personal reflection and something that we can view and not be so constrained by a theory's assumption, or a theory's critical or framework. So the second question being, are you becoming more increasingly aware of things that we need to learn and unlearn? I think on a daily basis, I'm constantly looking at my language and the words I use, or the way that I speak to students, to make sure that I'm not, assuming that a student may know what something is, or what something may not be. There are cultural differences for me and then the students that go to Valdosta State, and to assume that anyone knows something that I know, as a colloquialism, is something that I'm constantly aware of, as well as using terms. 7 years ago, I was using retard and gay just as much as another person that did not know what those words really meant, or didn't understand the effects of those words. And I think that I've come a long way, but finding myself to realize that there are still things that I'm saying and doing that associate with bad terms. So much like you, Dr. York, Katie has called me out on a couple of times, especially in the realm of heteronormativity. I think I made a comment in an RA class that, you know, there was a scene in Pitch Perfect where two females are naked in a stall singing, and I made talking to another student. I was like, oh man, you know, as a guy, I didn't get turned on by two naked girls in a stall, and that was just kind of like, you know, to me, I was like, oh my gosh, it's sort of normal for me, and I think that was the point that Katie was making, is that just because I, as a male, believe that doesn't mean that all other males in the world believe that that's something that would turn them on. And you know, that being a casual conversation with a student or a casual conversation with somebody can lead to being, you know, this very offensive term. Luckily, that it was not offensive. He's actually now my RA, and we have a good relationship, so that's good. So I think I'm constantly trying to look back on that and make sure that I'm not saying or doing things that are offensive by any means. And I think that I'm also trying to learn some of the cultural aspects down here. There's a lot of terms and words used that I don't understand, and you know, it's I'm not trying to necessarily use them, but trying to understand how they can be used or how they can be understood, so that in having conversations with students, especially in high stress, high tense situations, I can sort of break down those words and help, you know, facilitate a conversation. So I think in that, you know, it's a constant struggle of learning and unlearning. I feel like that's just sort of a normal thing to do nowadays. I, Recently, I haven't thought of it like a good example of that. Um, I know that going to India showed me that, you know, there are things that I take for granted that I didn't know I took for granted. So, you know, in that, you know, things like service at a restaurant, or you know, having fresh water and stuff like that. So things that I didn't even really think about, and I think I'm constantly trying to make sure that in daily interactions, and I recognize that people say certain things, and you know, and those things can be offensive, and I also may do the same thing. So making sure that I'm constantly critiquing myself. um, as far as the institution goes, that's kind of hard. um, there are policies and procedures that perpetuate certain ideas and traditions that could, you know, perpetuate this idea of a bias. I think in general there are two major functions that I see. One being that there's a good old boy system where it's who you know, and that tends to be highly involved with older white males. And I think that in that, you know, that tends to be something that you see in the South, according to what I've heard. I don't know that as a fact. And I think that that perpetuates this idea that you can't really get anywhere without that. And something that I heard over the summer during focus groups and things of that sort was that even in as a university, we only look at it in black and white, literally black and white. Everything is black and white. We forget about other subcultures and other minority groups that are not represented. It's you're black and white. There's NPHC and IFC. There's, you know, CPC and, well, NPHC again. And I feel like that's also something that's been perpetuated. And there's a constant. There's talks a lot in SGA and amongst the higher ups about integrating those things and making everything mesh a little bit better. And I think targeting two groups of people is perpetuating this idea that there are only two groups of people, and that's just the way it is, when in fact that's not the case. So I mean, I can't think of any particular policies at this moment that perpetuate these ideas, especially not in housing. I just, you know, we try to think that we're inclusive, and we try to be inclusive, and I can't think of any particular way. I mean, there might be some things, but most of them are routed through safety and security. So I'm not really sure about that one. So I guess with that, I hope that I answered all of the questions correctly. And I hope that I really do thank you for posting for us, because I think we were a little bit at a loss in trying to figure out what we were going to do, or if we were going to do anything at all. So I'm glad that this worked out. Thank you, and see you in class on Thursday.